What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another video. And probably to the surprise of nobody, if you followed my channel for a long time, we're going to be talking about Modern. Modern is easily my favorite format to play. It's very broad in the decks that you are going to see at any given match. It's a super diverse meta game. It's a lot of fun to play as well. There's a lot of like cool interactions and stuff that definitely pay you off for having knowledge of not only the deck that you're playing, but as the format as a whole. So today we're going to be addressing kind of the problem of Modern currently, and you might be able to tell exactly what that is by looking at what I have put up on the screen here. But of course, if you are not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more content like this, other Pioneer content and so on, please consider subscribing to the channel, ring the notification bell so you know when those videos get posted. And if you go to the link down in the description below, you will find a link to my Discord server. Feel free to join over there as well. So in the Modern metagame, and historically speaking, aside from Hogak Summer, and even like before that, where we had Izzet Phoenix, there hasn't really been a time where a Modern deck has like truly dominated in the way that Rakdos Midrange is currently dominating the meta in terms of its metagame share of the format. I mean, it has almost twice the metagame share as the next highest deck, and it's crazy if you like doing some quick math, like it has just about as much share as the next three decks behind it, which is crazy and honestly pretty toxic in terms of just like a new player experience or even like a returning player experience. So for those of you who don't know, Rakdos Midrange is essentially Rakdos Scam / Rakdos Evoke. This deck was probably about like 5, maybe like 8% of like the meta before we had Pro Tour Lord of the Rings, and then we had Lord of the Rings come out and whatnot. And kind of as the meta game has progressed, it has went from a deck that you would see that was unfair, kind of toxic to play against, not very fun when it got to do its thing, and then was like okay when it played like a mid-range game, to just being super toxic and being seen, almost every time. I mean, when I played in Columbus, I played 5 rounds, and 3 out of my 5 rounds was against Rakdos Midrange, and only losing to that deck, is crazy. I mean, it's fine when it does like its mid-range thing, but it is very toxic when it does its scam thing. So we'll look into it here in a second. Of course, you see the next 4 decks that are played in the format or that have the highest like metagame share. You have 4-color Omnath, which is at like 11.5% almost. This deck I think kind of gets a pass. Explaining here, Rakdos Midrange is essentially a midrange deck that has a super unfair mode where essentially you just get to take your opponent's 2 best cards, and more than likely you don't get to play a game of Magic. 4-color / 5-color Omnath is different in this way because it plays kind of like this like value-y control deck, and usually those things kind of get a pass, at least in my mind, if they have like a higher metagame share than something like Rakdos Midrange. Essentially, because I relate it to how Force of Will decks kind of don't necessarily run Legacy, but they're like a necessity for Legacy. While I definitely don't like the price tag of this deck, because it's just far and away more expensive than anything else on this list, it is kind of in place to, I think, check some of these other decks. You have, Omnath and stuff. You have the One Ring, which gives you protection if you cast it from everything, and allows you to kind of catch back up and kind of offset some of these 2-for-1s. Granted, now that we have the Beanstalk card or whatever from Wilds of Eldraine, which makes this deck a lot better at negating those 2-for-1s from like their Solitudes, Furies, and things like that. That it doesn't really necessarily need the One Ring. But, with that being said, it is a deck that plays a lot of powerful cards in the format, and I think does a very good job at checking, the Ragavans, the Orcish Bowmasters, the Dauthi Voidwalkers, the Yawgmoths, and so on and so forth from these big things. So I'm a little bit okay with these 4- and 5-color decks having a larger metagame share than something like Crashing Footfalls and Yawgmoth. For the fact that I think something like that is healthy, albeit probably not to this degree. I think any deck that has like a double-digit metagame share should definitely be looked at as, probably needing a nerf because there's a reason why it's being played this much. And that, should put into perspective how ridiculous like this almost 21% metagame share that Rakdos midrange has. So, looking at the deck real quick, this is just a deck list from I believe this was the Worlds event over the weekend, or like 2-3 weekends ago at this point. So you have Grief, and then you have this card, Not Dead After All, and Undying Evil, which basically says that like when a creature dies, it'll get returned to the battlefield. And it'll have +1/+1, Not Dead After All, making it an aura that also forces your opponent to lose a life if the aura is put into the graveyard, and then Undying Evil gives the creature Undying, which means if it didn't have a +1/+1 counter on it, it comes back with a +1/+1 counter. So the setup is that you cast Grief, pitching a black card. You Thoughtseize your opponent with the the Grief trigger. You take their removal, presumably any sort of interaction they have for it. Then you cast one of these two cards, and you get to bring it back, and you get to take your other opponent's card. Effectively, while you have spent like 3 cards to get this 4/3 into play, you have also taken your opponent's 2 best cards, and more than likely any sort of interaction that they could have to actually out this creature, and essentially can allow you to win the game with no resistance. On top of that, too, while they're trying to answer this Grief, you have cards like Ragavan, Dauthi Voidwalker, eventually Croxas. You have Orcish Bowmasters for a little bit of hate. If they try to cantrip into answers, Bowmaster can punish them as well by making a bigger threat and also just constantly pinging them. You have Thoughtseizes and even like other Griefs and stuff like that. Like you just have answers to, if they try to put up enough things in play to kind of block the Grief, you just fury them away. They don't play any creatures and they're playing removal. Well, they have to contend with Ragavan and Dauthi Voidwalker. This deck, when it does the scam thing, has found a way to just absolutely kind of like overpower everything else in the metagame. It's just something to tell like newer players, returning players, people that are playing the format. We can all find out real quick that taking your opponent's 2 best cards and them keeping a close 7 or a close 6, when you get griefed like that, damn near makes your hand unplayable, and just absolutely ruins your draw, and you're going to need a very specific set of draws to out this card that is going to kill you in 4 to 5 turns, depending on what you do as a player, if you have to shock, fetch, so on. And then again, on top of that, if trying to deal with this thing in combat, basically impossible. This deck is playing its own fair share of like Terminates, Fatal Pushes. You can also just Not Dead After All / Undying Evil the thing again and take another one of your opponent's cards, and then you killed both of their creatures, and they're kind of back in the same spot now, actually down a card. They're worse off than this Grief in play. So this deck is super hard to kind of contend with. Just even the 4-color control decks kind of have like the best answer, or one of the best answers, in the fact that it can Solitude, but to do it on turn 1, they also have to go down a card. So as the red-black deck, you are pitching a card, Thoughtseizing your opponent, they exile it, sure, okay, you still take one of their cards, and then you play Ragavan, and force your opponent, like, hey, you need to have either like a Prismatic Ending, which they more than likely pitch to the Solitude, to end up actually getting rid of the Grief so that they didn't get scammed. And then on top of that, you're just stuck having to answer. You're going to be able to snowball like this extra mana into a lot of these other spells, playing a Fable on turn 2, which can generate even more mana. You can kind of like get this going super quick and eventually just close out the game. So like this deck is just super powerful in a lot of like the theoretical play lines and stuff. Definitely when this deck plays just like a mid-range deck where it's just playing like a turn 1 Ragavan or playing a turn 1 Thoughtseize, maybe going into like turn 2 Dauthi Voidwalker, leaving up for Bowmasters, whatever, this deck is definitely very manageable in that sense. But when it gets any sort of draw that is even close to the scam draw that we are used to seeing, the Grief or like the Fury plus Not Dead After All and Undying Evil, this deck is very, very hard to beat and is very frustrating to play against, and it makes it feel like you lost the game, not because you made any wrong decisions, not because you necessarily played bad, but because you weren't just playing this deck in the first place, or that you even won the die roll. So definitely with a rising metagame share, like I said, this deck price start out is like maybe like 4 to 8%, 5 to 8% of like the metagame share, and then like since the Pro Tour and thereon after, it's been a double digit archetype in the format and just slowly increasing. Definitely having enough time for the metagame to try to adapt, and even with like new sets, of course we've seen kind of like the top like two to four decks kind of shuffle around, like some decks seeing more play than other, maybe some sneaking in and then kind of falling out. But the Rakdos Evoke deck has stayed stout at that number one spot and has continued to kind of extend its lead. I mean, it's pretty ludicrous how powerful the modern format is, how, historically speaking, outside of like a few instances, how diverse the metagame has been. And, we've had a time in modern where it seemed like 10 to 15 decks in the format, like no joke, 10 to 15 decks in the format could, go to a tournament and one of them could win, and that like the best deck in the format, was like the best deck because it was like 2 or 3% more likely to, win certain matchups, or just overall have like a 2 to 3% higher, match win rate than some of the other decks, which I mean, really, in a format like modern, that's a game of inches, like that's really not a whole lot. And sometimes that's all you need. But, that deck also came with like a very high like skill cap and everything. So like you only hit that if you were, very knowledgeable of like not only the deck, but the meta itself. So, definitely, I put Rakdos as not necessarily an easy deck to play because it is a mid-range deck, and I think mid-range decks do take, some time to kind of learn, what kind of like what you want to do, how you want to sequence. But you definitely don't need to be a genius to grief your opponent and then, Undying Evil, Not Dead After All. Like you can, I think as a player, you can easily identify like what cards are going to deal with my threat. And then if they don't have any cards that deal with your threat, you say, okay, like what cards could they play that'll get them back in the game, and then you just answer those questions, and you essentially pray that they don't do anything. And I mean, again, like you're just playing so many more powerful cards on top of these other threats that it really does make Rakdos a problem. And I mean, I can go on, and I've kind of went on and on about how good this deck actually is, and in the hands of like some really capable players, this deck is even more dangerous than what it already is, in just conceptually. So of course, we talked about it. What changes can we make to kind of like help the Rakdos deck? Essentially, I guess I really help the other decks in the format and kind of nerf Rakdos and try to come up with a solution for the format. And I think I might have come up with something, a few concepts, and obviously, of course, a few cards to be banned as well. So let's go ahead. We'll shoot over to the first card and kind of explain some of the other things as we go on. So transition now. Okay. All right. Sorry. So here we are. Probably the most obvious answer to the question of how we change the modern format is we just ban grief outright. While I think grief does kind of get hit, with grief getting hit, kind of intentionally hurts some of the other decks. Of course, we see decks like Living End playing grief as kind of like a way to, clear the way for their spells and everything. I just don't think it's necessary. I mean, I think there's an overall good if grief is, the card that gets the axe versus, something like the return spells and stuff like that, which I don't think are necessarily ban worthy on their own. Of course, pretty good. If you want to keep grief around, I guess that's kind of like what you hit. Because I really don't like hitting the other cards. Honestly, even though like Ragavan is, super powerful, I kind of like the fact that it's legal in Modern, especially with it being banned in Legacy. I kind of like it being a Modern legal card. It just feels very powerful. It plays very powerful, but a million and one different interaction pieces in the format help with Ragavan. So I think grief, for the most part, has to be the card to go. I'm fine with people if they want a Fury and not dead after all it and everything, because I think just like being able to interact with the board in that way and with some of the other utility that Fury has, I think is used in a fair enough way to where I'm willing to keep that card around. Where Grief, getting a free discard, and for the decks that are able to actually leverage and use it, end up using it. Very poorly in terms of how the play pattern of games go. Of course, we just outlined for the Rakdos mid-range deck that getting to essentially take your opponent's two best cards kind of stops them from playing Magic. And then in the case of like Living In, it essentially forces your opponent to have two pieces of interaction. They're going to find this pretty reliably with, playing 15 lands. I mean, I think they have enough of a boost for the fact that they only have to play 15 lands and they have like a million cyclers and then a million other ones that end up actually helping them get lands. I don't think they need on top of that to, have a card that will allow them to Thoughtseize their opponent for free and check and see if the coast is clear for them to execute their combo, or if they have to wait until their opponent's turn and whatnot. So I definitely think overall Grief banning will be a net positive. However, if you wanted to keep this around, I would suggest changing how Evoke works, which I think is going to be a lot harder to do than just banning Grief altogether. Essentially, you make Evoke just something that like happens. Like if you evoke a card from your hand, in this case of Grief, you pitch a black card. As soon as it enters the battlefield, it immediately gets sacrificed. There is no trigger that goes on the stack. There is no way that you can respond to it. Essentially, if you want an evoked creature to die and come back, there has to be some static effect on board that will allow it to come back, or you have to like target with like a reanimation spell and bring it back. At least this way, you still get some benefit for, death triggers like sacrificing the creature and whatnot. But you definitely get around, the ephemerate / not dead after all / undying evil / whatever else that affects Grief and kind of makes it this impossible card to kind of deal with, and this like 3-for-2 kind of, you know what I'm saying. I doubt that is something that will happen. We've had Evoke for a very long time, and really on like Grief and to an extent Fury, these are the only cards where, you don't want your opponent to double up on these. Sure, you have like the Muldrifters, even like Solitudes, Endurances, whatever. Those cards are like fine to get back and double up on their triggers, but I think Grief and Fury have the most egregious abilities on them to be able to blink and bring back, and also just be super aggressive. And while on top of that, I guess if they remove the menace from Grief, that would also kind of be a fix, but that would just be something that's like very hard to do and not something that like I recommend. Irradiating cards is just kind of weird in my opinion. So I think in that way, you either change how the evoke mechanic works altogether, or you just ban Grief outright. I think that you will see kind of you'll see Rakdos mid-range kind of like be a deck still, but you definitely at least then have a choice between playing something like Jund mid-range, where you're playing like Wrenn and Six and stuff like that, and like Tarmogoyf, or even playing like this Urza Saga package, or you're just playing the more consistent version of a mid-range deck being red-black, still very powerful, still playing all these great powerful spells. You just don't have many free ways to kind of like win a game and stuff, and at least add some diversity to the format by introducing the idea of other mid-range decks being around, because they don't have to try to fit in this super powerful combo on top of being a functional mid-range deck as well. There's one more card that we're going to look at, and it's going to kind of contradict what I was just talking about, but let's go ahead and transition over to the next card. So the last card we're going to look at is Wrenn and Six. Now, I know I just talked about their, if we ban Grief, you have some access to playing like Jund and Wrenn and Six, and, to an extension like Tarmogoyf, but really Wrenn and Six is kind of like the main draw to playing something like Jund mid-range. Even like the 4-color control decks and some of the other like 3, 4, and 5 color decks play Wrenn and Six, because the mana fixing is just super invaluable. The fact that the +1 go up to 4 loyalty, you return a land card from your graveyard to your hand, extends past just getting fetch lands and being able to, get Dwarven Mines in the case of the creativity decks, getting to fetch up Triomes and stuff in like the 4 and 5 color decks. also even just getting Urza Sagas and stuff back from the graveyard and just getting to continue to make construct tokens while getting, some fairly powerful artifacts from your deck as well, and just kind of like snowballing that advantage to a point where like your opponent really has a hard time coming back from it. I think at least if you ban you ban Grief, I could see, looking at Wrenn and 6 and potentially making a change, because at that point, 4-color control at least has a better shot at becoming one of the most played decks in the format. It already has, about 11.5% metagame share. I'm assuming that if you get rid of, the most powerful card in the Rakdos deck, that this deck probably 4-color control, 5-color control, whatnot, probably ends up getting a lot better, and then ends up being the deck that has 15% of like the metagame share, and climbing, for the fact that now the deck that would threaten it a lot in terms of just getting to kind of get ahead of itself is gone. Essentially it won't have that ability to do so. So I think at least targeting Wrenn and 6, or at least considering it, is a good option. And I think if Grief were to ever get banned, I'd want to see something like Wrenn and 6 go, or I guess even to an extension, just getting rid of all the pitch elementals. But mainly looking at Wrenn and 6. While definitely not a card that I want to see gone, just because I think Wrenn and 6 at this point is like synonymous with the modern format, and I have a soft spot for Jund, not because I played it personally, but just because it's a nostalgic deck for myself, seeing it in the meta, and of course seeing it like evolve and people continue to play it. I want to see it stick around. You could probably find something else for like the 4-color control decks to hit. You could hit Teferi Time Raveler, like that card's just awful to play against. You could hit Omnath, Locus of Creation, things like that. But Wrenn and 6, I think, is the more powerful card of all of those. So I think that's the one that you could look forward to, essentially taking out. It definitely hits a lot of other archetypes, some that you actually, I think, want to have around. But by and large, again, being the most powerful card, stops the, mana fixing and stuff that you have from these 4-color control decks. You can make the argument with them having the Delighted Halfling that Wrenn and 6, while not, as important as it was, it definitely can survive without it, and you're probably right. That said, it's still way better than anything else in that deck, short of like Omnath or like the One Ring or whatever. But that's just my feelings on the card. I wouldn't want to see it go, but I would also understand that if it had to leave the format, at least for the time being, while things kind of shook out and then maybe reintroduced later, I could come around to that idea. So yeah, that is kind of my ideas, thoughts, and stuff on the modern metagame, how we can make changes. There's a lot of other cards, but I think in terms of, instead of going Scorched Earth on the format and to try to make sure things change, I think you kind of take this approach of hitting something from the 2 best decks and kind of letting the rest of the meta shake out and see what happens, and then, make another banning, unbanning, and so on from here. I think that with not having a scheduled ban time, but just being able to, essentially a week in advance, be like, hey, we're going to have an announcement affecting certain formats, I think that kind of allows you to make some of these changes that are not necessarily, a super hard pivot into one direction, but rather like bannings and stuff that makes sense, and that you can kind of like walk back or even go further, in a month or two's time, and allow like the metagame to kind of get into a spot where it settles in and you see what's doing, what's popular, what's not popular, and essentially find a small sample size in how those changes work. So that's going to do it for me in this video. I hope you all enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like on the video. Comment down below if there's a card that you want to see banned in Modern, unbanned in Modern, to kind of help the metagame, because, Rakdos having almost 21%, just that ain't it. So yeah, I would appreciate that. Thank you everyone for subscribing. If you have not subscribed already, please feel free to do so. Ring notification bell, free, easy, supports my content, keeps me making videos. Yeah, that's it. Hope you all enjoyed. We'll see you all in the next video.